This is Conspirinormal.
Here we are, guys, on Conspirinormal yet again, and we've got a really cool show for you guys. And Serfiel, again, set this thing up tonight. He set up this whole thing as far as we're going to talk about ley lines. And we've got our good friend John Chadwick all the way across the pond joining us. And John, welcome back to Conspirinormal, man.
Thank you. It's really, really nice to be invited on.
Yeah. It's been a couple of years, but
yeah.
Here you are, and we're going to talk about a great subject tonight. And admittedly, it's one that I kind of had to do my homework on on the last couple of days. I didn't really, it's been an interest, but I don't really know a lot about this topic. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what we talk about. And Serfiel, kind of go on your idea for doing this show. Why did we want to do a show on ley lines?
Well, ever since the New Age really popularized these ideas, I think a lot of people have these kind of really vague concepts of, they'll talk about ley lines or vortexes or things like this. And without really knowing what exactly they're talking about or what these things really are or the history of our modern conception of these things. So I know me and John have talked about this stuff a lot. So I thought he's been doing a lot of research on the similar thing called a similar phenomenon called spirit roads. And so I wanted to get him on and, us kind of give a background of where a lot of these, our modern conceptions of these ideas came from, because a lot of it is in England, with the, lining up the historic structures and megaliths and those ideas. So, just want to bring him on and talk about kind of all this stuff, earth energy, ley lines, spirit roads, where all this really comes from, a lot of the European history, and then bring it back over here to the States too, in the Native American stuff. So I thought it'd be good to get him on, and let's just kind of give everyone a primer on this stuff. And he's been doing a lot of research on spirit roads in particular, I think.
Yeah, more so than ley lines. But then there's a blur of what these things are, and almost like what has entered into the modern, I'm going to say modern folklore, because I think that's really what we're talking about. And the ley lines themselves could be deemed to be that, certainly by mainstream thinking. This is not something which has any weight to it. But if you were to watch Ghost Hunters or something like that, you would find that it's kind of like this very pronounced thing that is real. So, yeah, I have been doing a lot of looking into it over the last week or so, and I've learned so much myself that I didn't know. It's a really fascinating subject. For the human race, I think it's got something to do with the culture, a very, very early culture that has been re-recognized.
Yeah. So the popularization of these ideas that have really come from the New Age and magical / occult revival in the 60s and 70s, even that had still a really strong English and Irish influence. And why do you think that was, that some of these figures first started to really look at this phenomenon in the UK?
Well, the first person to be talking about it is my old friend Alfred Watkins, and I think that's probably got something to do with it. He coined the term, and he was a businessman from Herefordshire, and so this was back in 1921. On June the 30th, he was. Now, some say he was driving along, and then I've seen other things saying that he was riding along on a horse. So we've already got a touch of folklore happening here, because there's this weird little doubt here.
Yeah, 1921, you could have still had either one. So
Of course you could. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe he was driving in a carriage. Who knows? Anyway, there's this guy, and he's on this road, and he sees what he called it's like a chain of fairy lights across the landscape. He said he saw it as a series of straight alignments across the countryside, marked by such things as standing stones, wayside crosses, ancient churches, and hill forts. So from his vantage point, he saw that all of these things had lined up, and it suddenly dawned on him that basically that there was a reason for this. And what he came up with was that these were trader routes, and there wasn't really anything mystical about it. I mean, later on, it's been said that he'd had a mystical vision, but he himself at the time was very adamant that no, this wasn't. This was a recognition of something literally on the landscape, and it was almost as if, well, the most obvious way of getting to somewhere before you've got roads and you've got transport and all of these things is that you're going to be walking on foot, and it's going to be most obvious that you kind of like walk in a straight line.
Yeah.
And if there's something in the way, then maybe you would make a diversion, or you would just clearly walk over it. So that's what his original idea was, and it wasn't picked up by archaeologists. It did become very, very popular, and then a club was set up where you had people who were lay hunters getting really into searching these things out. But he wasn't actually the first person to be talking about some of these things. He was probably just the person that brought it to the forefront. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he's a really interesting figure. And then basically the war came, World War II, that is, in 1939, and all of the interest in this stopped, and it was pretty much forgotten about until it came back in the 60s. It was almost as if it had been rediscovered. But sorry. Go on.
Well, where was he investigating? What part of the country? Was it primarily the south part of England, where a lot of the stone circles are?
Well, he seemed to be looking. They seemed to think it was all over the landscape, but he'd been looking at a lot of different places. I mean, certainly he'd been looking at Stonehenge.
He was a brewery representative, so I think he was going around the whole country trying to sell their beer pretty much to different places.
Right. So, I mean, then there were other people that then joined in. There's a guy called Admiral Boy Somerville, who was a member. And then he started looking at things in the Scottish Hebrides and in Ireland. And he made this really cool observation. There was a guy called, I'm just going to go back a little bit. There was a man called Sir Norman Lockyer, who was a researcher on astronomical orientation of ancient temples. Yeah. And he noted that Stonehenge was aligned by the rocks to certain directions, particularly to sunset and sunrise on particular days of the year. So from that, you've kind of like got this connection now of you've got routes leading to these places in the landscape that almost again fit and connect with this idea of lines coming out of dissecting these circles. And this later guy, Admiral Boyle Somerville, who was a member of the Straight Track Club, which Watkins had set up, he noticed that these things were the same in the Scottish Hebrides and in Ireland. But he also noticed that some of these alignments, they continued in lines to marks and notches and cairns, which are piles of stones, and earthworks on or near hilltops going up to several miles away. Well, we can look at that and kind of like go, that's really fascinating. But when you're talking about notches, I mean, what is this? Somebody seeing something for real, or is this somebody kind of like going, oh, there's another one, oh, and there's another one, oh, and there's another one? And then it becomes like him looking for a pattern as opposed to him actually discovering something of any importance. The fact that there is other things on these alignments is curious. I mean, there's no way of getting around it. It is curious. But then we've got a lot of criticism. Firstly, there was one that went through a peat bog, and it was very much a case of like, come on, nobody in their right mind would walk through a peat bog. They'd walk round it. And Watkins had replied, well, you're thinking as a modern person. You're not thinking as a person at the time who might have thought of these things in a different way. And that was the first time there was an element of the importance of these things from above, and viewing these things not from the side of the average height of a person, but actually from a bird's eye point of view. And he seemed to think that was quite important. He certainly started to have some leanings towards the more mystical aspect, but most certainly at the beginning he was completely utterly adamant that I didn't have anything to do with that.
And then before him, there had been a tradition of antiquarians, I guess really starting with John Aubrey, who discovered the Avebury Temple in 1648. And before that, I know some of the antiquarians even theorized that those were just built by the Romans, and they thought a lot of these roads were just built by the Romans. But he kind of then inspired William Stuckley after that in the 1700s to kind of find this national pride in this Druidic past, however much of a kind of mythology that was, still recognizing that these were ancient structures built by native people in the Isles.
Yeah, the thought being and now is that like they think that the Romans just improved on the roads, that they just paved over them, so that's why they thought the Romans built them, but that seems to not be the case.
I think really why this old straight track probably took up in England first was because just the megaliths were still there, because they were hard to get rid of, and I guess they were seen as a enemy of a lot of the farmers. They were actively trying to destroy them, but they just couldn't because they're just so huge.
That's right. I mean, certainly when you're looking at something like Stonehenge and the Bluestones having come from Wales, I mean, it's a distance. I mean, it's not something that somebody's going to have to really put a real effort in to get those things from one part of the country to the other. But what people aren't taking into account is that the landscape was different according to where water was. So in the same way that we now know that the Egyptians were moving their stuff by boats that could be taken apart and shifted over land and then put back together again, there's no reason why people weren't doing exactly the same thing, in which case it would have been much easier to move them. But who knows? I mean, you could even use something to move them upon, like a stone, a fulcrum would actually make it quite easy to move a stone for a group of people. It would still be problematic, but no, it's fascinating. But one of the other things that I think is of interest is that Silbury Hill, which is the largest man-made earthwork in the UK. I mean, it really is quite a steep thing to kind of get up, and it's flat at the top. That is part of the Avebury complex, where you've also got these lines, you've also got a stone circle, you've got burial areas and all kinds of things going on there. You've got this old Roman road that passes down by the side of Silbury Hill, and it kind of indicates that that this is a Roman road, but it's using something that was there beforehand. And so, as it's part of the old Neolithic complex, then, as far as I understand it is, and it has been, well, then in which case we are talking about the Romans certainly have adopted things. But there's no reason for us not to believe that Stonehenge was there originally. There may have been a holier, more sacred site there, that has been put on in the same way. We just don't know.
Yeah. That same idea that then continued with the Christianization, with the supplanting of the ancient sacred sites. Most of the old churches were on these sites that had significance to the Druids, and continues today.
A lot of those old churches, interestingly, have got yew trees in the area, and they tend to be significant to the older traditions. Certainly, it was something that you could make bows from. And so you've got a resource there that is of importance to the community. I'm thinking of Lastingham, North Yorkshire, very small village, but the church is just absolutely remarkable because it has this crypt underneath it where I know that St. Chad and St. Bede had been through as they were bringing Christianity through the country and bringing it northwards. And so you've got this really ancient place with this slap bang in the centre of the earth. And sure enough, there had been a pagan place beforehand that had been built on. So this has gone right into the ground. It's gone into the heart of it, and it has the weirdest atmosphere. And it's one of these places where if you record, you'll pick up strange, almost like ethereal voices. You'll have things like battery drainage and all kinds of things. And dowsers go there. I know Northern Earth Mysteries, who have come from this whole movement of ley lines and what have you. They've done studies there and things. It's a fascinating place.
There was something that I read today, actually. But what was that you sent me about that 66-page chapter, Serfiel? Who that the author of that was? But there was something I read in that today.
John Michel, The View Over Atlantis.
Yeah, where he talked about how there's some legends about these churches that they were actually moved by the fairies, and interesting legends like that kind of lend to them being that they had to be built in that particular place on these lines.
Yeah,
thought that was really interesting. The kind of intersection between the ley line concept and also fairy folklore too.
They're also called fairy roads, right?
Right.
Well, I think so. I mean, I'm not, splitting hairs. But the phrase fairy paths comes up a lot. I'm sure people also would. There's no reason why people wouldn't refer to them as fairy roads as well. But yeah, this is something which goes right back into the oldest traditions within this country, and probably, certainly in rural places, you still have these beliefs that these are lines that are being used by spirit. Now, you can say spirit as in elementals, as in fairy folk, the other. Or you can use the word spirit, meaning dead and corpses and ghosts and what have you. I mean, even in Shakespeare, there's a line by Puck where he actually says, we're now at the time where the spirits are coming out in all of their different kinds, and they're using these routes between places. That was not how Shakespeare put it, by the way. That was me. He was a bit more eloquent.
You were paraphrasing.
I was paraphrasing. Just in case anyone was quoting me there for their essays at school. Don't. But yeah, this is an area where I'm going to go to this book written by my friend Andy Pachoric, called Strange Lands. And he has got a wonderful list of names given to spirits from folklore that have used these things. So, are you ready?
Sure, absolutely.
Ignis Fatus or Fartus and Corpse Lights, also known as Ignis Fatui, Fool's Fire, Fairy Fire, Fox Fire, funeral fire, elf fire, walking fire, shell fire, rolling fire, will o' the wisp, will o' the wisps. Oh, sorry, that's will with the wisps, willow wisps, willy wisps, will o' the wikes, wheeze, sees, Billy with the wisp, Kitty wee the wisp, Kitty with the candlestick, Kitty candlestick, Kitty o' the canstick, Friar rush, Friar's lanthorn, peg a lantern, Jack a lantern, Jack o' lantern, Jackie lantern, lantern men, hobby tails, or is that hobby lantern? Hobbledee's lantern, Jenny with the lantern, Jenny with the burned tails. Oh, she sounds an interesting person to come across late at night on one of these roads. Jill Burnt Tail, Joan in the Wad, John in the Wad, Moon Dancers, Husky Punks. No, I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Hunky Punks. Sorry, that wasn't Husky. It's my eyesight. Hunky Punks. And then you also have Hinky Punks. I don't know. Maybe Integrity of the Hunky Punks. Maybe the Dicks, the Hinky Punks. I don't know. Pinkets, Punkies. So we've got the Dead Kennedys there. Puck Lights, Puka Lights, Ghost Lights, Taned Elidladen. This is getting into the Welsh. Canilwal Kurth, Gaelgan, Tyna Sith, Canwyll Corff, Canwyll Corff. Then you've got corpse lights, corpse candles, corp candles, dead candles, Sealam lamps, fair maids of Ireland, weird lights. That's almost like Lovecraftian. Bob-alongs, blobs, globs, globsters, Death of the Druid. I mean, that sounds like a death metal band or a black metal band there. Death of the Druid. I would listen to them. Droid, Water Sheeries, La Fau Boulanger, and Fields, and then this one at the end, Sand Yan Yitad. I mean, that last one is so Lovecraftian. That is great. And these are all basically the names given to these small lights that are seen using these roads or connected to these roads, these routes that are travelling along these alignments. Now, why that would be, I have reason to question, because obviously we're talking about folklore, but people are still seeing these things. I've had my own experiences of them in the Avebury area, and this is an area where people are also seeing things like UFOs. I mean, we'll probably come to that later when we're going to talk about John Mitchell, aren't we, later? But one of the things that I find really fascinating is you're not just seeing these lights. There are people seeing spectres and ghosts. So you're getting headless horsemen, you're getting carriage ghosts as well, road ghosts, things that will run alongside you and try and push you off the road, things that will lead you away and lead you into danger. That's where will-o'-the-wisp often comes in. You don't want to follow these lights because they will lead you off a cliff or into a marsh. And then you've got this really interesting thing as well. There's a lot of associations with black dogs. So you've got these weird hounds, like the ones that you would have in, for example, The Hound of the Baskervilles was a play along this kind of folk story, where you've got these wild, mad dogs that are also being seen on that area. You've also got things like cows dying and things like poltergeist activity. If you were to build your house on one of these paths and obstruct it, so you'll be talking about things like purports and apports of things appearing and disappearing. Ways to defeat that would be hanging up little spirit traps, like crosses with strings on them, which will catch them. These are very, very similar to what Native Americans are doing with dream catchers. so similar, in fact, that there almost certainly has got to be some cultural connection to that. You've also got things where people will block areas so that spirits won't be able to get in or get out. You've got these areas in around Stonehenge called cursuses, which are delves into the ground. And one of the suggestions has been that because there's stones around the outside of them, that they're places to have trapped spirit as a resource, maybe, as a way of, I don't know, like a bomb silo. You know, if somebody's going to give you hassle, you know, let's release one of the Billy Bobs or whatever it was they were called. You know, one of the hunky punks. Let's get one out of the embankment and launch him at the French or something. I don't know, but I find that really fascinating because the way that those stones would be lined around these things, and they're long. You know, there's about 1.5 miles long. One of these things. You've almost got bars around the outside. And I was kind of joking with you two earlier when we were discussing all of this, that if you actually look at Stonehenge being a circle with these stones standing around it, and then you've got these more complicated kind of structures on the inside, how much of that is like one of these traps for catching wild fish? That once they swim in, they get confused and can't get back out again. And I think it would be great if Stonehenge was just actually a really, really cool spirit trap. You know, they've got in and they've been wandering around there for millennia trying to work out how to get out again.
So then these folk traditions continue into the Christian era as well, and they really center around funerary rites, and the townsfolk have specified paths to the graveyard that's usually adjacent to a church.
Well, for some reason, there's some ruling that basically only certain churches can bury the dead. Mm-hmm. And so you've got things like, communities where they therefore will now have to trek to this other area to be able to, get a Christian burial. And so you've got these things take very odd and interesting routes. There's rituals where people would have to have walked round a hill fort, for example, maybe several times before continuing onto their route. And so you've got this connection with taking the dead along a route to somewhere for burial. Then you have stories where people have actually seen funeral parades going past on the roads. There are people who then have claimed that they've seen trooping fairies using the paths themselves, again, in a procession. You don't want to get in the way of them. They're not all small little things. These are kind of like people who are 3 foot tall, dressed in almost like peasant dress. They're not the elite aspect of the pharaohs. This isn't Oberon. This is almost like the peasantry, like a lower class. But then you've also got these elves, spirits, fairies that are the same size as the average person. So you've got like a real range of what these descriptions are. Then you've got this really fascinating thing where along the route there are places to rest the coffin, and that's when people will do things like say prayers. It might take somebody overnight to get the coffin there, so they would stay somewhere along the way, and at this point they would be doing rituals to kind of bless the spirit of the dead and what have you, because people were very adamant that when I die you will take me by that, otherwise I'm going to come back as a revenant. Then we've got something else where you have necromancy, which sounds absolutely terrifying. It's straight out of Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. This is audio, isn't it? Nobody would have seen that.
I was gonna add something just to that about the processions. I've heard similar stories like that about Hawaii, that there's these little creatures that do these processions. So you mean we're talking about, the British Isles, and then we're talking about Hawaii. We're talking about two separate cultures that were separated for thousands of years, but yet they have similar stories that fit with each other.
Do they also have the necromancy aspect? I mean,
I don't know. That's a good question.
We're not talking about people kind of doing some kind of like black magic rites, which the word necromancy tends to be connected to. We're talking about mediumship. We're talking about seers. And you would have specific people in the village whose job it was at some point during the year, a special day, to basically sit in one of these areas, quite often, on top of a hill fort, or notably at the way into the church. You would have a specific set of styles to get through the church. You would even have somewhere where you could rest the coffin in front of the church. And in that little alcove, you would have somebody sitting. And what they would be looking for is who in the community was going to die within the next year, because they would be able to see the funeral coming along the road. And then you would also get this thing where they are using this for direct communication with the spirits and gaining information from them. And what's fascinating about that is that we find exactly the same thing in shamanic culture in other parts of the world, to do with the same idea that spirits are traveling in a line between one area and another area.
And a lot of it's really about the successful crossover to the afterlife or world of the dead, because if it doesn't happen, then they're going to come back and haunt you. That's
right. And again, as far as Dungeons and Dragons is concerned, the word wraiths is used, that wraiths are seen on these roads. Now, these aren't kind of like some kind of Scooby-Doo ghost, like an empty cloak that you would expect from imagery. That is just the shade. It's the shade of a living person who is already moving on that route because they're going to die, which is really quite odd. I mean, there's noted stories where seers have predicted their own deaths and made the point of saying to their neighbours, "You will take me to the church via the corpse road, and if you don't, I will come back." There's a story connected to one in Danby Dale in Yorkshire that has that story with a particular seer. So there's clearly something very old happening here, and the traditions have then continued.
And then you've also I read that book you shared with us, some of those chapters, and there's rituals for binding spirits to particular places. It's all some of it is about, like, they'll circle around something, kind of like you talked about before. Like maybe some of these things are to catch spirits or to prevent them from haunting you, I guess. And the crossroads too comes into this.
Oh yeah. Well, the crossroads. Firstly, one of the most obvious things in the folklore is that the cross is the Christian cross. Anything outside of the Christian cross is like no man's land. It's a purgatory. So anybody who's buried there, this is basically them being cast out. That's the reason why people are hanged there. There was a particularly gruesome thing, which a lot of people don't realise and don't know, is that there was a practice, and it was stopped in fairly late in the Victorian period, where murderers, after they'd been executed, they would be an area of the centre of a crossroads would be dug up. The person would be put in there almost upright, and they would be staked and the stake would run straight through them into the ground. So it's like it's earthing, like electricity. It's earthing that horrendous person and their spirits, so that they will not be able to come back and haunt us. And there was a bit of an outcry about this in the Victorian period, where people were saying, this is really barbaric and this needs to stop, because you would have people again almost like huge. It's a day off work, and we're going to nail Jeffrey Dahmer to the ground. They were doing this like in the centre of London,
Yeah.
So
the crossroads, also in American folklore, is very important. I mean, if you're familiar with the story of Robert Johnson, they go make the deal with the devil at the crossroads. Also, black dogs in American folklore are associated with the crossroads too, as are crows.
That's right. All very similar things.
So all these ideas, I guess, kind of just gestate after the Second World War. I mean, there's still people interested, right? But it's not really until the 60s that they become popularized again, because people are looking for, they're searching for their roots, they're searching for a pre-Christian past. So what really happens around the 60s and 70s?
Well, you've got a lot of new ideas to do with freedom of expression.
Yeah.
And so even Aleister Crowley comes back into vogue. I mean, he's even on the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover. And then obviously, as that moves into the late 60s and the 70s, you've got people like Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin, Geezer Butler from Black Sabbath, with this interest in these esoteric ideas, which obviously have been associated with Satanism. I mean, eventually that will end up in the Satanic Panic, and people blaming Judas Priest for their son having shot himself, etc., which of course it has nothing to do with at all. Aleister Crowley, when faced with something like that, would just say, well, that was his choice, and he was a bit of an idiot. And it wouldn't have anything to do with the devil. I'm not a huge fan of Crowley's, but of course you can't deny the man's importance on the 20th century, because...
So, the Straight Track Club is revived then, right? And it becomes the Lay Hunters Club?
Right. That's another thing. Yeah. So you've got this thing happening with the UFO subculture as well, happening there, where you've got things like festivals happening. You've got Glastonbury Fair happening, and that's happening where the tour is in Glastonbury. And then you've got all these psychedelic bands and people using hallucinogenics and all kinds of things. You've got bands like Hawkwind and Gong playing, and the sex is easy, and a lot of the constraints of the past have gone. Because this is the war baby generation, and so they've been raised with rationing and all kinds of stuff, and it's gone. So now they can do what they want. You've also got the pill, so people are kind of looking for new ways and rejecting old ways, and so the things like the ley lines will have been of fascination to them, because you've got this idea of what England was. The Lord of the Rings also has a hugely important thing happening at the time as well, which you can see in music. I mean, even Mr. Spock had a song about Bilbo Baggins.
And what a great song it is.
It is, and what a great video.
And so this all these ideas kind of coalesce around what becomes known as the
New Age?
Earth Mysteries movement.
Well, I think that would have been a pocket of it. Whether or not everybody who's getting stoned is into that. But there's a lot of new ideas to do with the culture. I mean, you've got the Process Church kind of coming up in London. As well, and then obviously I suppose the culmination of all of that is the Manson family in Los Angeles, or outside of Los Angeles. But as for John Mitchell, who was one of the big people that we were talking about, he had some really strange ideas where these little lights, the hunky punks, whatever that you want to call them, are now to do with it's almost Graham Hancock, but with no grounding. There's like this ancient serpent cult that was worldwide, and what they were actually really worshipping were UFOs, because even when you come to the Japanese culture, you've still got these lines, but they're also connecting it with dragons, and they're just basically seeing, for some reason, flying dragons in the sky as UFOs to him.
Right.
And so you've now got flying saucers, which he's very openly using that term because that's the period, which to us would probably seem quite ridiculous now if somebody was to call such a thing a flying saucer. But that was the go-to phrase. So you've got flying saucers using ley lines to get about.
This idea that ley lines might have been a part of some kind of ancient lost technology.
Yeah, which Walter Bosley talks a lot about that in his books about and especially with like the airships, what he sees as the rediscovery of the ancient technology, that the airships are gliding across the ley lines using the electromagnetic energy or whatever it is. That's a big element in his stuff too.
Well, I did an interview with Walter, which is in one of the Urban Weird books put out by Weird Harvest, which is the publishing side of the folk horror revival. And there was a lot of things that he was saying, which for me was like, can this be real? Can this be true? And then when I would go away and have a look, and it's like, oh my God, that is weird. There is something strange happening here with Disneyland. I don't know, maybe if you want to get onto that later, but there's certainly the way that thing has been built, which actually fits to a lot of things to do with lays and henges and burrows and what have you. There's something odd about it, or it's coincidence. But we were now on to telluric energy, aren't we? And lines of latitude, and this idea of this Earth grid, which isn't necessarily the same thing as ley lines.
I really want to stress that. I guess Michelle is really seen as being someone who really puts this stuff together and repackages this all together.
Yeah.
Because he sees this like dawning of the New Age that he gives England a special place in, because he's this kind of like mystic hyper nationalist, it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
And his politics get a little dodgy. But I guess I want to read some quotes just so we can kind of like put it in context. He says the evidence here assembled points to the former existence of a civilization based on the manipulation of certain natural elements, a form of spiritual engineering whose implications are now barely conceivable. He talks about how part of this also may be consciousness change, and that these environments create a kind of revelation, which is what he thought Alfred Watkins experienced when he first had that revelation about the Old Straight Track. And he says, this is all from the View Over Atlantis. He says, its essential element consists of a method whereby certain incommunicable knowledge can be gained through a course of study in preparation for induced moments of perception, in which aspects of the hidden universe stand out clear and orderly to the inner mind. So that's the whole idea, too, that these places actually affect consciousness.
Yes. Yeah. And that also fits with a lot of the shamanic ideas that you will find in tribal communities, certainly with the Aboriginal in Australia, and also I think when you get into North America with the ancient tribal cultures there. There's a couple of things to do with those kind of ideas which echo with separate sources for me as well. I mean, this is one of the interesting things when you get into this. You actually find that sources which shouldn't be related appear to suddenly have a connection of ideas. I mean, one is the idea of holy lines in Germany, which is about the same time as Watkins. There was a guy called Joseph Heinz, who in 1939 he had a paper called Principles of Prehistoric Sacred Geography, and he spoke of, again, lost magic principles by which holy sites had been located in the past. And he claimed the sites were points on geometrical figures in the landscape that are made up of lines based on fractions of the Earth's dimensions. Now, you've also got a guy called Wilhelm Teut, who was an evangelical parson in Germany, and he claimed that these astronomical lines were called Heilige Leinen, which is literally holy lines. And
Right.
He saw them radiating from a rock-cut chapel, which was actually in some twisted stacks of rocks in Saxony in West Germany. And he thought that it was a solar observatory, and these lines were radiating out of the center of this thing, and that then again you've got alignments on it. And so really, for me, when you're talking about Mitchell, he seems to have taken the Watkins idea. He's kind of taken the more shamanic kind of like ideas, and he's taken this. And with you talking about the nationalism, it's interesting that those ideas were also picked up by Heinrich Himmler during the rise of the Nazi Party. So you've also got this nationalist aspect of it, and this national pride to do with ancient traditions and heritage, which, you know, if you look at the far right now, they're also using that terminology to justify their beliefs, and it's almost become a replacement for the white power that they used to. But you know, these are things that are very much coming out of Europe. I don't know what it's like over where you guys are, but
there's some elements of that, a little bit, but not as much, I think, as in Europe.
I think there's certainly elements of it coming from the black metal scene in Scandinavia.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
Because, well, you've got all that stuff that happened with Mayhem when they first started in the church burnings. Not that I think that they're all anything to do with, because I mean the guy who started the band Mayhem, he was a communist, so you couldn't have got further apart politically.
Serfiel isn't that Varg guy the one that killed the other dude? Isn't he really far right?
In fact, he's ultra-nationalist, Norwegian.
Idiot. Am I allowed to say that? That wasn't too harsh a word, was it?
Be careful.
You know.
Be careful. He's got a lot of fanboys out there.
He's already killed somebody.
Yeah, and he only served a small amount of time for it as well, because of their system is very liberal. So he wasn't in for long, and he had the chance to write some other albums on Bontempi keyboards and things. But I mean, I've heard him say things about that serpent cult as well. Interestingly enough, and he's said that basically that they had the image of the serpent outside of temples and later churches. And from what I gather, talking to people who are part of the pagan heritage culture and what have you, and living that tradition and have the knowledge that that's actually untrue. So, I mean, the last thing I want to do is get into trouble with the far right again. I've had enough trouble with them.
So I guess a lot of this comes to next really comes to the ideas of astronomical alignments being the source of a lot of these lines. They especially are in Europe with the standing stones and with some of these complexes being astronomical devices to view they have markers for the solstice and equinoxes, and you see that all around the world, and it seems unrelated from the spirit road ideas, but when you think about it, their importance they had in their cosmology to the spirit actually passing on through specific astronomical phenomenon, it's basically the same thing. They might have oriented these things to keep track of things not only for agricultural reasons, but for spiritual reasons, as for the spirits actually passing through certain constellations or the Milky Way or whatever is specific to that culture.
That's right. And I think if you look at what's interesting is if you look at the shafts in the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is now being seen as like metaphorical route for the spirit to actually leave the king's chamber up to the outside of the pyramid and out to the stars. I think, is it going to Sirius in the Orion's belt or something? You've got a similar thing happening there. You've got a route of sending the dead onwards into the other world. And, you know, you can understand how something like this would work. I mean, people haven't got the same ideas of they aren't blessed with our knowledge and our information of how the world works, in the same way that we aren't with our descendants who are coming, who will see everything in a completely different way and see us as being idiots. So you can use these astronomical alignments to make predictions. And that is a very powerful thing. This is man taking control of the landscape. Because once you understand how the seasons change, now you understand basically things about getting resources for the winter and harvest and planting seeds. And so I suppose this is an aspect of magic for these people.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would be a form of geomancy, right? Which really
Absolutely.
is what we see in the Far East as well, in Asia and China with the ideas of feng shui. Some of this all really ties in.
You've got a lot of similarities to feng shui. Again, you've got this element of basically that you don't build on these lines. You don't put blockages on these lines. The spirits are using these again for travel, and they travel in straight lines. You've got to keep these things clear and fresh. And there's an interesting story that comes from Ireland about a man who was having problems on his farm, and a traveller who was working there telling him basically this guy's cows were dying. What does that sound like? You've got balls of light passing through your area, and your cows keep dying. I mean, this is Skinwalker Ranch all over again, but this is in Ireland, and he's advised basically to keep his doors open on the front and the back so the fairies can pass through. And that is also something that you'll get in feng shui.
Yeah,
you've still got rules in Iceland, basically, where you can't build on these paths, and
they build the roads around fairy hills and all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
and in China. The paths were owned by the emperor, so if you built on those, that building was going to be torn down and you were going to be punished. And there's a story that I came across where a guy had died and had been wished to be buried in a particular place, which happened to be on this path, and the authorities made them dig him up and move him and bury him somewhere else. And when the Chinese had their revolution, and got rid of all of their emperors and what have you, that guy was dug up again and buried back where he wanted to be, because now it was like, freedom, you can't tell us where to bury anybody, we're burying him here on the Spirit Road. So there's some really fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've got, again, this idea of burying people on these areas, things to do with the dead. The avenues leading to Stonehenge, which were procession ways, they've got people buried along the outside of them, as have those curses, I believe, which were suggested to be these sources of power for keeping spirits in them.
So then these sites themselves that would be these astronomical tools, a lot of them in different cultures were seen as kind of like a microcosm of the whole universe in these sites, because you were replicating the skies here, and then these are the places where heaven and earth are meeting. I just want to read a little something from Hancock's latest from the America Before book. He says, all these places are man-made sanctuaries that speak to the union of heaven and earth at key moments of the year. They might rightly be described as hierophanies because their fundamental purpose is to reveal and manifest the sacred connection between macrocosm and microcosm, sky and ground, above and below. And just like Stonehenge has these stones that are aligned to see the solstices, you have that, of course, in the Great Pyramids. You have that in the Americas with the alignments of the mounds, in the East, and then in the West with places like Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde having these type of alignments. And it's really interesting, and it seems like different phenomenon, but when you really tie it all in, it's all still about the afterlife and about the connection of these two worlds.
Yeah. And I mean, when you've got cultures that have become separated by landmass, they're going to take on different cultural ideas, but it's still going to have a root in the same thing, in the same tradition of the origins of, who knows, when there may have been a group of 10 humans, naked and afraid. That's what it makes me think of, watching some of those people on that TV program trying to get through 40 days in a little unit. You kind of look at basically a culture starting, and you don't know what those original people of the human race, when they're coming into kind of like a Homo sapien form, you just don't know how they're thinking and why they would be doing that, and then why they would be repeating these ideas. And then that's when you get a religion starting. And then as their offspring end up going Hawaii, Australia, the British Isles. Of course,
so there's that idea.
There's cultural change, but a similarity.
There's that idea that these things are really just so ancient that they've been carried everywhere. But then there's also like the Hancock type ideas that there was a previous like mother civilization that all of these are kind of remnants or even corruptions of afterwards. So
that's right.
Whichever one is the truth, but we don't necessarily, using these ethnographic analogies, mean to say that one came from the other or anything like that. Like I really don't know. I think it's fascinating though.
I think there's a danger where people always get into this phrase, this idea of cultural appropriation, and I can understand why somebody would get pissed off that another culture has nicked their an element of their traditions. But at the same time, the way that culture works is like meme. And I'm not talking about memes on the internet, on social media. The original meaning for meme is basically how a phrase will come up. Like somebody will stub their toe and will have just said bloody hell, and then somebody else sees that, laughs, and then when they stub their toe, they say it, and before you know it, you've got an entire country saying bloody hell as this gets passed on, and then that would then move over to another country, etc. There's all kinds of things that happen that way, and it's not cultural appropriation, it's just the way that ideas move. I mean, the original ships that had sails, I believe, were Thai. So the very fact that the Greeks would then have used them at a later date is not cultural appropriation. That's just how ideas circumnavigate, which is something that Robert Anton Wilson was really fascinated in, because he thought that basically the faster that we were able to move around the planet, the faster these ideas would then move around the planet also. And so as we're entering the digital age, we have the internet. Now it's all hyperspeed. So you get kind of cultural ideas happening at a microsecond, whereas before they would have taken 100 years, maybe longer, to shift from one area to another. But yeah, as for the ancient civilization that Hancock talks about, that is fascinating. And they may have been the survivors of a previous civilization themselves. I mean, who knows? Mm-hmm. Who knows? We have no idea.
Should we talk a little bit about some of the sites in North America?
Yeah,
go for it.
Well, we can, but I wanted to. I didn't have as much just marked for that. I kind of just want to explore some of these general ideas. But I know in the Southwest in particular, I've shared some of this stuff from this book, Prehistoric Astronomy of the Southwest. Shared some of those pictures. You can just see in the Four Corners area the Chaco Canyon and ancient Pueblo Anasazi culture. The use of these lines and these sites are, I mean, it looks like some of the old straight tracks that Watkins was first drawing. I mean, the connections between all these kivas and big villages and astronomical instruments and places. There's all these straight lines. They use mathematics and geometry just as advanced as all the other cultures at the same time. And it's pretty wild, and unfortunately, those things haven't been as well preserved in the eastern United States. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot harder. I haven't seen as many people actually tracing all these sites together in lines like they have in the Southwest, because only, I think the estimate is only like less than 10% of these sites are remaining. And you had just as extensive
horror stories of places that are being basically just flattened.
Well, that's what I'm saying. In where you're from, these stones were just so much harder to move that you still have them on the landscape. But if people could have, I'm sure they would have just destroyed
of course. Them. Well, certainly, you've got buildings that have suddenly randomly above a doorway will have a little bit of an arch in there. That people have literally just taken from some monastery that had been sacked by Henry VIII when he got rid of the Catholic Church. He created the Church of England and burnt a lot of the monasteries. People just use the stone. Well, why not? It's just rubble. And you'll find the same thing that had happened to the pyramids in Egypt. The locals just took the stone. Why go and make more stone when you've got a great big pile of them over there that nobody's using? It's logical.
Right. So many of the Indian mounds in this part of the country were destroyed. So many of them, and we're lucky that we have
into the 80s.
Yeah, we're lucky that right. I mean, we're talking fairly recent times, and we're lucky that we have as many as we do here now, and they've been preserved.
And we're hearing more and more and more about that tradition and that culture now, which I think is great, because when I discovered that basically wigwams and teepees and what have you that I was used to seeing in John Wayne films when I was a kid isn't actually how native people lived. that was something that they were forced into, maybe, or they used when they were kind of like traveling. But they did actually have a lot of fixed areas. That was mind blowing. That was a revelation. That was all new. And it's like, well, just led to believe that they are just nomadic people going around scalping people. And all of it is just very, very unfair, isn't it?
There was civilizational collapse that was enormous right at the time of initial European contact with the Spanish. So by the time a lot of the French and Anglos were actually coming through the eastern United States, those civilizations were already wiped out, and the remaining people, they knew they had lost recollection or couldn't communicate where that stuff came from. So in the same kind of antiquarian traditions where people might have thought that the Romans built Stonehenge, here you had all this speculation, and that's kind of the ilk that things like Mormonism come out of, all this kind of mythologizing of the American landscape, because there had been this total civilizational collapse of very advanced agricultural hierarchical societies in the eastern United States, known as the mound builders now, which is goes back at least 2,000-3,000 years.
Yeah, it only took the DeSoto expedition and other kind of sustained contact on the coast to bring that about. Right. Once the smallpox hit, it decimated that culture.
But also possibly some internal struggles too. There might have been their own civilizational problems.
Right. Well, a lot of people don't realize that, like, the Cherokee, which are the main tribe of our section of the of this part of the Southeast where we live, is they actually came later. They actually came around about the 17th or maybe even early 18th century. They moved in, and like what was there before, they were not the Cherokee. That was a totally different culture that had been wiped. They had the same thing happened in the same thing happened in the Amazon too, right? They were wiped out, and they think now that what was there when I think it was Oriana, the conquistador, sailed down the Amazon River to the sea, that there was a quite advanced civilization that just was wiped completely out.
Well, and the English didn't even, DeSoto documented all that. Yeah. But they didn't get a hold of the actual writings and journals of DeSoto until I think into the late 1800s.
Yeah,
so
it
was already documented, but these were just ghost towns to them.
Yeah, it's at least 100 years, maybe even 150 years before people start going into that area again. Europeans. So it had been gone a long time before that.
But I think that a lot of them recognized, I think people who were, we were talking about some of these antiquarians in England. I think a lot of their ideas and other ideas and Atlantean ideas really influenced some of these pioneers who were more mystical minded at the time to recognize in a lot of these structures these same ideas of alignment, geometry, etc., and really contributed to those ideas of there being some kind of trace here to this ancient global civilization or other civilizations.
Well, you've got the theosophy, haven't you, at the end of the Victorian period into the Edwardian period, which gave birth to an awful lot of these ideas, which you can see echoed in John Mitchell. You've also got later on in the States from that, you've even got somebody like Joseph Campbell who's talking about connections between mythology to some kind of like worldwide human original kind of culture where all ideas had come from. And although he isn't esoteric as such, he's coming from a Jungian point of view. Certainly Carl Jung was esoteric. You've got people like Manly P. Hall over there, really looking into a lot of these esoteric ideas and their connection to initiation and logging this stuff. Israel Regardie. He'd gone from being Crowley's secretary. He was he British? He ended up over in the States and bringing a lot of those ideas. Wasn't he? He was the first person to publish the initiation rites and practices of the Golden Dawn, I believe, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Which obviously had a huge impact. So, yeah, you have inherited some of this stuff from, I suppose, from the UK, but at the same time, Blavatsky herself, she had travelled all over the world. She, I guess, brought things to the UK herself. I mean, the Golden Dawn supposedly had its roots to groups that were doing things on the continent. And a lot of these things, for some reason, all seem to kind of like have some interest in the Knights Templar as well, which I find very interesting.
So then, really, I guess where we can go from now is that into the age of technology, into the scientific revolution, where a lot of these figures are actually more mystical than we'd like to think now. Did some of these ideas get continued? Into the ideas now of telluric currents and the development of radio and things like this, where some of these people kind of using ancient ideas and trying to find some scientific basis for them to try to exploit it.
Well, if you look at Nikola Tesla and his idea of beaming electricity across continents, and this free power source coming from these towers, I've already seen people saying that this is what the pyramids were, and that all of these ancient sites were connected in the same way. And so you can see basically, has the Tesla thing gone into the ley line thing, or did he have ideas that had come from the whole the other direction? I don't know, but certainly when you've got telluric energy, that is real, but it's not as powerful a thing as people would like to think that it is. It's not this incredible current that's firing off. It's not like something that coming.
You can make a small clockwork. That's about it. It's like 1 volt.
But from conversations with Walter Bosley, the people who were putting the telegram communications down, they were the same people that owned the railroads in the States, and so they were using telluric energy to help up the communication with the telegram.
And I believe the railroads were creating the railroads themselves were creating a lot, also.
Yes. Well, if you think about it, a train station and a railroad going to another train station, what have we got there except that you've got a site connected by another site? Is that drastically different? It's not hugely different from what Watkins was recognizing. It's just not.
And just in my own studies of local history, there was a lot of railroad men who were very mystically inclined. In the United States, especially, as far as I know. Here, there was a lot. So there's got to be, I think there was something to it.
Well, why was that then? That's something that I really don't know anything about. What was the inspiration there?
I don't know. I'm just finding in my just delves into local history how many of these very powerful railroad men were very into esotericism, mysticism. Of course, they were all Masons. And so I'm just wondering if in that they would be more inclined to try to, exploit something like this, or if that had a dynamic in the development of the railroads.
Right. Absolutely. I was going to question whether or not there was a Masonic connection.
I'm sure, absolutely. I mean, just like a lot of other industries.
When you talk to Freemasons in this country, they don't seem to do a great deal apart from getting pissed together. When I hear about the Freemasons in the States, they seem to take it very, very, very differently and very seriously, and they are interested in a lot of these esoteric things and these old traditions. I mean, I was invited to join for the first time a couple of years ago by a guy who was dressed like L. Ron Hubbard on his yacht. And he was part of some, I can't remember what he said, the Sheffield Yachting Association or something. And I was like, Sheffield, you haven't got any water. It's landlocked. What are you on about? And he said, exactly. And when he flipped his badge over, it had bullshit written on the other side. I'm not joking. And I was like, oh, I thought you were going to say that you were Freemason. Oh, he said, we are. I was like, oh, I've never been asked to join. He said, well, there you go. He said, where's your local lodge? I'll put your name forward. And I was just a bit blown away because there wasn't any kind of like secrecy. It was all kind of like, let's get pissed, let's have a fun time. And there was a couple of them all dressed in these yachting outfits. And, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's like having a Czech Navy. There's no water.
So let's talk about your interview with Walter. That's in the one of the Urban Weird volumes.
Oh, it's just absolutely, it's just fascinating. I mean, he's a fascinating person to listen to anyway, and so I can't remember the name of the engineer that he was talking about. Do you remember?
Is it the one that he said that he had spoken to the guy, and when he was?
No, that was actually Watkins. It was actually Watkins, which he felt like he had actually had an encounter with in Disneyland, and of course Watkins would have been dead for a long time. But he later picked up a copy of, it must have been the old straight track by Watkins, saw his photograph in it, and instantly recognised him as being this Alfred that he had actually met at Disneyland. And he's adamant about it, He really is. He seems very straight up in a lot of ways, does Walter. But I mean, that story sounds slightly far-fetched and slightly ridiculous, but he's very serious about it.
Oh yeah, he's very serious about it. Absolutely, yeah.
And synchronicities like that. I mean, even if it was just happened to be a lookalike, that doesn't matter, because synchronicities like that happen anyway, where there's like similarities to something, which kind of like take you in a certain direction. So I can't remember what the name of the engineer was, but it was somebody that had been brought in by the Disney brothers to do the engineering, and he actually chose the site. He was connected to an awful lot of people involved in esoteric thinking and research within that institute that he'd come from, which consequently was also, connections to MK Ultra, and it was where, now hang on, what's his name? Is it Inigo Swan?
Inigo Swan.
Yeah. He was also there doing a lot of his research into, what we would now call out-of-body experiences, I suppose.
Remote viewing.
Remote viewing. Yeah. And so you've got a really interesting place there with a lot of interesting research going on, and that's where Disney goes to get somebody to help him design his idea of fairyland. So the theory is that Disneyland has been built in this particular place, chosen by this esoterically minded engineer, because it's where the telluric energies can be drawn up and can actually be transmitted. Now, one of the things that Walter brings up is that Disneyland is actually in a little basin. They actually built up a ditch around the outside, which they've actually got a train track running. I've never been. I don't know if either of you two have. I've been to the one in Paris. I haven't been to
I've been to the one
over in.
I've been to Disney World, never Disneyland.
Yeah. Disney World's the one in Florida, right?
Right.
I don't know if they're all built in exactly the same way, like following a certain pattern. But the one in Disneyland certainly has got it's in a ditch, and that as an earthwork, again, it's very similar to a lot of places which have got henges in them, and I just find that interesting. His explanation is that once this energy is being drawn out and thrown out, you've actually now what you've got is motion happening around the outside in a continuous route going round and round and round and round. And so as this energy comes up from the center and it's pushed out, well, you've got kind of like natural forces moving things around. It's almost like some kind of a Tesla device in itself, and the energy is basically thrown back in. His idea is that basically it's there to kind of like keep people, open them up in a certain way, almost to heighten their experience of being there. And then on top of that, there's a lot of imagery in Disneyland to do with things like King Arthur and what have you, which would be, from a Jungian point of view, would be picked up and you would understand it on a subconscious level, and that would, again, help bring on this kind of experience. It's almost like a subliminal message that it would help build up this fantasy world. Then you've also got the Sword in the Stone, which is the Sword in the Stone comes from the film, the King Arthur one. Oh, it was actually just called the Sword in the Stone, wasn't it? The cartoon that they made. You've got that now on the central point. Originally, they had the carousel on there, so you've actually got something again spinning, and that supposedly was drawing up the energy. You've got weird symbolism on the carousel, like caduceus, again, esoteric ideas, which he seems to think is helping spread this energy out. And it all sounds extraordinarily far-fetched. But then I went to have a look at this drawing of the sword ceremony that he said that they do on a daily basis, where they choose a king of the day, and he lifts the sword out of the stone, which Walter seems to think is basically unlocking the energy and releasing it, because they've moved the carousel and they put that there in the place.
Okay. Interesting.
And I went and I had a look at one of these videos. I looked at several, one after the fact, actually after I'd written the article. I must admit I was a bit disappointed because the first one that I found was very eye-opening, because you've got Merlin using dowsing rods around this point to choose the king of the day. And obviously you have dowsing being a regular thing that lay hunters use to pick up lines of energy with ley lines. And they douse ancient sites and all manner of things.
John, let's talk a little bit about the Aborigine material, about their roads, and then there's some things that you sent also to our little group chat. We'll talk about like the Nazca lines and this idea of like, we touched on this a little bit, but the idea of ritual that's involved with these lines, that this seems to be very important.
I think it is. And I think that maybe this, with the Aboriginal culture being so untouched for such a long time, and I think that you've got something which could be looked at as being as close to the original source as you can get. Over huge areas, they have what they call song lines. Now, in their tradition, they have got sacred sites which they would, if you were to travel to, you have got this idea that some great event in Dreamtime has happened there. The Dreamtime is their equivalent to the spirit world. That you've got these strange deities that take different forms, animalistic forms, that they basically were living here, and that everything has kind of like come from that time. And you can still feel them, you can still communicate with them through shamanic trances and the like. So at each location, their equivalent of Stonehenge, it might be a mound in the landscape, it could be a cliff face, could be a large rock like Ayers Rock. You've got a tradition there and a song to sing, which retells of the event that happened in that place. And from that place, you will be able to see another place where you would also do this. And so they've got roots between these places, these sites, which they can travel along these paths just to be able to get about. Because if you're out on walkabout by yourself, you've got to know your way round and how to get back to your people and your tribe. And what's fascinating is that they can do this over huge distances, and they're mapping, because that's what it seems to be. Apart from the spiritual aspect, their mapping is passed down through oral tradition and memory, through myths, in songs. And also you have the shamans who will use that site to then communicate with the spirit at those sacred places. So you have, once again, you have walking from place to place across the landscape. It is exactly what Watkins was talking about when he first saw what he did in Herefordshire. Now, if you can imagine that blown up to be right across Australia, that's an achievement. That's absolutely incredible. I mean, how many of us need a shopping list to go and get the groceries? These people can remember all of this information just through song, and because I suppose they didn't have any other technology.
Well, like I think it was Paul Devereaux's book that you sent a couple of the chapter about the Nazca lines. And I mean, that was fascinating in that you've got this idea that they're traveling along these roads and these paths are kind of like a ritual. And there was something in the Gates of Atlantis book about, some of these lines forming almost like parts of the body or like a human shape almost on the landscape. And so with these two ideas, it was also fascinating about the Nazca lines. It's just like a lot of people have, the ancient aliens, that was always the big thing. They're runways. You can only see them from the sky. There is an interesting thought that they could have built some balloons and they could have gone that way. But it's also very fascinating that the possibility that they were actually having astral projection, out of body experiences, that they could then hover in a spirit form or in their trance state, and they would see the lines. So that ties in also with the Aboriginal experience too.
And it also ties in with that shift in Watkins' idea. If you remember me talking about the criticism of this can't be a footpath that goes through a peat bog, who would do that? And Watkins said, well, you've got to accept that people might be thinking differently, and that these things maybe need to be seen from above. You've got this idea that basically not only does spirit use it, and not only do the fairies use it, but you've also got seers. And we have that connection again, going back to the corpse roads, where you have people doing communication, again, with spirits at rest points along the corpse road. That's exactly the same. It's just a more modern version, and it's a medieval version. Into modern times, there's an interesting book called Light Quest by Andrew Collins, where he's actually really investigating these balls of light phenomenon, and why it is that when people see them, they also have strange experiences. Not all of those strange experiences fit together. So some person would see a UFO, some person would see a ghost, some person would see a demon, another person would see a black dog, or what have you. But the origin of it all is these balls of light. And one of the places that he studied very closely was the Avebury complex, which is of interest to me because that's one of the places where I first experienced these balls of light for myself. He has a story about people camping on top of Silbury Hill, looking over to West Kennet Longbarrow, which is basically a burial place. And from there, seeing lights come down across the road. This would all have been, again, routes down to Avebury Stone Circle, straight down these avenues towards the old Roman road I was talking about earlier, which supposedly is also on a lay, which runs straight past Silbury Hill. They came down, and as they came down, these balls of light changed to what appeared to look like people sitting in a yogic position, like in a meditational state, in a lotus position, inside a prism in this ball, and then it floated off down the road. That doesn't fit with any UFO description I have ever heard of in my life, but the weirdness of it fits with, again, this idea that you're sitting on one of these places on a corpse road on top of Silbury Hill is like a huge place to rest and stop, and you're encountering something magical in that landscape that doesn't make any sense. And does it need to? Does it need to be anything more than that? What he thinks is happening is that these things are somehow projecting your library of images back at you. So what you're experiencing is a personal thing that's come from your own subconscious. And that's why some people would see ghosts, because they're looking for ghosts. It's why somebody else would see a UFO, see a craft, because they're looking for crafts. And it's why people would suddenly see Bigfoot attached to these things, because it's something that's in their library. But what it actually is, we don't know. But that would be some attempt by it to communicate, and maybe we are just misunderstanding the message, or we can't communicate with it. And so people get scared. I talked about my experience the last time I was on there, on the show with you, didn't I? I believe, so people could go back. But when I had my, the last thing that happened to me, which was all very much like poltergeist activity, while staying in the Red Lion Inn in the centre of Avebury, I saw a manifestation at the end of the bed, which looked like a cloaked figure. And I just instantly thought, and I don't know why I thought it, well, obviously I'm going to see a druid. I'm in the middle of Avebury Stone Circle. That's ridiculous. That's so corny. And I don't know why I thought it. But when I did think it, it changed shape. And it would now look like it was a woman from like a Jane Austen book, wearing a bonnet and that kind of like shoulder cape, which was quite a similar shape in silhouette, if you like. It was just small shift, but it was no longer looked like the Hermit from the tarot cards, and it now looked like, I don't know, Elizabeth Bennet. It's like, did it do that, or did I do that? So,
yeah,
I don't know what this is, and maybe we haven't got the tools to measure it.
right.
I just don't think that we can see far enough yet.
Well, and speaking about some of your personal experiences, you believe you have one of these spirit paths going through your home, right?
Yeah, I've been told so by a couple of mediums and different occasions, people who aren't connected to one another. There's a couple of things that always come up. They always mention the name Jeb. I don't know anybody called Jeb. He's apparently a school friend of mine, and he rides motocross bikes. And he always wants me to know that life has its ups and downs, just like him when he was doing motocross. And it's like, great, thanks for that again. I don't know who this person is. I have no connection to this person. But they always bring this up. And one of the other things is your house is full of spirit. You've got a spirit path running through it. And that's the reason why you have the activity that you do. And then an ex of mine was a medium. And there was one evening that we had to sleep in the front room, and we were sleeping with our heads literally on the route that supposedly is there. And we had just the most appalling night. I mean, she was complaining at spirit being around her all night long, all trying to get her attention, all trying to communicate to her. I had basically what I thought I'd seen people walking around. But regularly, you can be sitting in the front room watching the TV. We've got a glass door from the living room area into the hallway. Regularly see somebody walk past there. And the dogs pick their heads up and they look. They even go to the door to have a look. There was one occasion that I'd gone into the hallway with my nephew, who is now 15 or 16, still very confused by this occasion. And we had a big, thick curtain across the front door to keep the draft out. And it suddenly just looked like there was somebody standing behind the curtain. It had that shape of somebody there. And we heard the door handle go down, and we heard what sounded like somebody trying to open the door, like really rattling it. And then the curtain kind of parted as if somebody was coming through, and both of us were just absolutely like, what the hell? What is this? And nothing came out. And we were just looking at each other, and he said to me, "Did that happen?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What was it?" And I said, "I don't know. Just don't worry about it and don't question it. Don't worry about it." I've seen things in the bedroom. People have seen things in the bedroom. There's a woman in a red dress that comes and stands at the bottom of your bed. She looks like some kind of Spanish lady, long dark hair. There's a boy who quite often hear running. And then we found out that a child had done an accident on the hill, sledging on a dustbin lid, and had gone under a lorry, and that he'd actually been brought into the place, and he'd died in the hallway.
Oh, man. Jeez.
My nephew was sleeping in one of the rooms when he was a child, and he had some kind of, like, it was the worst nightmare you could possibly have, let's say. He burst into the front room, and all he could say was, "The boy, the boy, the boy, the boy, the boy, the boy," and he was crying his eyes out, and he was shaking with absolute fear, and just had to calm him down. And all he would say was, "There was a boy in the room. There's a boy in the room. I don't like the boy in the room." My mother's seen things in that same room. All the same. She actually woke up during the night, and she saw this boy stroking the dog, who he often sleeps in that room, and he was awake, sitting next to the bed, shitting himself, with my mother saying basically there was a child stroking him in the room. Okay, so now this is before... this is before getting to things disappearing and reappearing, random things that you need, like maybe once or twice a day, but you suddenly can't find them, and you know where you put them, and they are no longer there, and they will go missing for weeks. And it's like, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to sort my phone out because it's running out of power. Just plug this in, get some energy to my phone.
John,
I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. John, is it now? Have you looked to see if there are any kind of like ley lines that run through the house? Have you that there's anything in like any literature or anything that's about this or?
Well, people have said to me, you can't have one running through your house because to be running through your house, you would have to be near a church. And why they presume I'm not near a church, I have no idea. Because the house is built on what used to be a tennis court that belonged to a much, much larger house directly opposite. It was part of their grounds. And they have an old stone wall behind the back of their house, and behind that is a church. Is a Catholic church. And the road that we're on is called Church Hill. So we've got a church right in front of us, and at the bottom of the hill, guess what there is? A church. Yeah. There's another church.
So you got a couple of them.
Yes.
Okay.
And one of the things that people never talk about is they always say how long a ley line is. I've never heard anybody say how wide a ley line is. And as we're right directly next to this, there is something happening. There is certainly something happening. We had an experience with another. I've got a long list of ex-girlfriends and failed relationships behind me, guys. So I keep having to go back to another time with another woman that was there. I am a failure at romance. But there was one time I was with this particular person in the garden, and there's a log shed with logs piled up because we've got a wood fire, and so I was in the garden and walking along with her, and then suddenly there's this guy just standing there with his back to us, just staring into the log shed. He's wearing jeans. He's got some kind of like a padded, like outdoorsy kind of waistcoat on, and a shirt on. He's got kind of like reddish hair, kind of tied back with an elastic band. He just looked like somebody who was about to start nicking things. And we just both just stood there looking at him. And it was like that moment where you're thinking, what? And then he's gone. And I basically said to her, what did you see? And she said, because I wanted to make sure that she had, before I told her what I'd seen, I wanted to make sure that I knew what she had seen. So she didn't copy me. I needed that. And she said there was a guy standing there, and she described him. And I said, yes. And that was just messed up because he was as physical as you two, as I'm seeing you two.
Wow.
I mean, it was just really strange. And he was there, and he was like he was lingering there, and now he's not. So the place where I've built my studio is right next to that, and I've got a window overlooking that, looking directly towards that log shed, because I'm determined that I'm going to see that motherfucker again.
Well, I would just be curious to know if there are any, with some of these hauntings or these poltergeist situations, some of the famous ones, whether or not there are any ley lines that run through some of these areas, and whether that's a factor with some of them. Because you said you've had poltergeist activity.
Well, it's not like here we don't get anything like stones being thrown at the house or anything like that. It's trickster stuff. So it's like I only drink decaffeinated tea bags, and I don't drink a lot of coffee. I'm not a caffeine person. And so I've got my own little tin that nobody else touches with my decaffeinated tea bags in on the kitchen counter where I know where they are. So basically, I make a cup of tea, I put all the cups out, I get the tea bags out, and I just sort myself out. Right. And they're gone. And it's like, and the whole tin's gone. So it's like, who's had my tea bags? Nobody knows. Anybody seen them? Have I put them in a stupid place? I'm looking in everywhere. I'm even looking in the fridge because there has to be somewhere where this tin has been picked up and put, and it has to be somewhere stupid. No sign of it. And this was while I was doing the show, and I'd even mentioned it to Melissa, and it must have been about 2 or 3 weeks later. I had now stopped drinking decaffeinated tea bags. I was just drinking regular tea. I'm making a cup of tea for everybody who's in the house. I put the kettle on. I go into the front room. I'm nattering, go back into the kitchen. And where I've put the cups of tea out, there's my tin of decaffeinated tea bags. And no one's been in there because they're all in the front room.
Yeah.
And they are now exactly where it was that I left them a fortnight ago. It's that kind of thing. And it's like, we just accept it now. We just laugh about it. It's not a scary thing living here. It's just a natural thing. And you just get on with it. And I'm sure there's hundreds of thousands of people worldwide who live
You
like
learn
this.
to live with it.
Yeah.
I guess is what you'd say.
Beyond that, that really draws from your personal experience. Do you have any other just speculations about what these lines may have been, if they did have any kind of power that could be tapped into, or consciousness change, things like that? Or
Well,
do you
there
have
is
any
that
just
interesting
speculation about
element,
it?
isn't there? But there's kind of like these new kind of ideas that basically that I think it's come from Jacques Vallée originally, that these things are here to develop us. They make us question the possibilities that we have, and so we aspire to, right? That's a spaceship, so therefore it's possible. So therefore we go and build one. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that there's anybody in UFOs. Certainly there's this phenomenon like ball lightning, which we know is just an electrical thing, but that doesn't behave the same way as these lights. These lights move with a sense of consciousness, but maybe that's our perception of them. They look like they have a purpose and they're going somewhere when you see them. And I've had one go past me that it was about the size of a melon. It was absolutely peach. It was bright orange. And it didn't care about me one single bit. It wasn't interested in me. But it shot off up a corridor, took a bend in the corridor and continued. So that wasn't ball lightning, because that would have gone straight through the wall. It would have exploded up the wall. You have aircraft passengers talking about these experienced pilots. The same thing, these lights pass through and they're on their route. I think maybe we're living with another species that we just don't understand. In the same way that before there were microscopes, people couldn't see bacteria or what have you. Maybe we just don't have the ability to yet. And when we do, it'll just be like, oh, it's them, and we'll have a name for it. There's life forms in all manner of different environments. To think that the air is free of life is ridiculous.
Do you think they have a special relationship to these lines?
I've no idea, but it's all the same information, isn't it? And certainly when I've seen balls of light in this place, they're on that line. Our front door, by the way, I should point out, our front door aligns almost exactly with the east door of the church that's next to us, which would be the entrance for taking bodies into the church. We just want to point that out, and it's got a cemetery next to it. And then further to the right, there's actually another cemetery, a much bigger one for the town. So there's a lot around here. Top of the hill, slightly to the left, you've got a public footpath which goes across the fields, the old public footpaths. They're the corpse roads. they're no longer in use. So that even the hill is directly connected to a public footpath. And I live just outside of Durham, which, you know, has got a medieval cathedral in it, and it's got a huge history. Anybody watching that program, The Last Kingdom, you're looking at basically where I'm living. If you get to see that on Netflix or what have you, this is where the Vikings were when they settled. So it's a magical area with a lot of fairy mythology attached to it, which I still haven't tracked down. That's one of the things which I need to do with Andy Pachoric at some point. We keep promising ourselves that we're going to be going out and looking at all of these sites and actually being there. The legend of Oberon that Shakespeare had in The Midsummer Night's Dream, that comes from this area. So it's a magical place. It's the land of the Raven King in what's the name of that book? Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Have you read this? Oh, guys, you're missing a treat. It's about the return of English magic into Victorian times, and the return of these older traditions. And they're all coming from County Durham. They're all coming from what was known as the land of the Raven King, which is where I'm living. So I don't know. I don't know what they are. The word fairy has so many dodgy connotations to it, doesn't it? Don't you feel a bit embarrassed to say to people, "I believe in fairies"?
Yeah, well, a lot of that's because of popular culture and Tinkerbell and all this kind of like, it's got this kind of girly connotation. But if you look at the folklore, it's actually pretty
far from that.
Pretty extreme in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I don't want to mess with them.
Well, I think just too, like, ley lines and these corpse roads and the ritual associated with it. Is there anything that you can kind of like, any conclusions that you can kind of come to about this? Or is there anything that you or is that just as mysterious as what inhabits them? Yeah,
something's happening. Something's been happening for a long time, and it's still happening. My question is, this church, the nearest one to me, is Victorian. So therefore, has a new corpse road formed to link to that church, or has that church been placed on its site because it was available and it just happens to be on a former corpse road that was going to the older church?
Chicken and the egg.
Who knows? But you just don't know. I mean, the fact that a new one could form, why not? Why not? Why are we presuming this is just an ancient thing and they're already there and it's static? Why could it not be that this phenomenon is capable of kind of like just going off on another route and let's make another one?
And I think especially if people were creating these lines as a way to basically, join the heavens and earth, that kind of intention is really putting something into it.
Yes, it is.
And if it's in a straight line and if it has these monuments and objects in it, I mean, it's got to have developed some kind of power, if only psychological.
And from a chaos magic point of view, as long as you think it's there, it will be. So as long as people believe that it is there, they'll be forming it. Which is interesting in itself, again. I mean, it kind of goes back to that whole thing of the observer over the proton and how it's going to behave when measured. Sorry, I'm getting a dry throat. That's the kind of principle behind how things kind of work in the universe, and we don't understand why. Is this actually just something, very similar that we have the ability to create? And maybe until Alfred Watkins turned up and said, "I've seen this and I think there's something there," maybe there wasn't. Maybe it took him to kind of like go, "Wait, it's that thing." And then it was, because that's the nature of the universe. And everything else has just spun from it and created it.
What I found interesting was how much...
Does a tree?
Yeah.
Do you hit the tree falling in the forest? Does it actually fall if you can't hear it? Or, sorry.
So there's so
What
much
were you saying?
criticism of Watkins and saying, this is just, if you take any random distribution of sites, you could draw these lines through it naturally.
Yeah.
But in the archaeological study of the Southwest in particular, these were, these archaeologists were drawing lines through things without connecting it to it, and it didn't have that stigma attached to like Watkins had. And so they're just like going at it and drawing lines through these different sites here. So that's what kind of struck me.
Yeah. But that's how lines work,
Yeah.
And this is the reason why people see things like pentagrams on Washington and stuff like that, or the pentagram in Whitechapel where Jack the Ripper murdered all of these victims, which doesn't look like a pentagram. That's just because someone's connected the points up. You could connect the points up in a different way and it would look like, I don't know, something else, which would not be related. I just don't know. But isn't that the marvelous thing about all of this? Is the not knowing is better almost than finding out the actual truth. The Loch Ness Monster being a large fish, that's not interesting. Who cares if it's a sturgeon? That's so dull.
It's a lot better that it's something that Aleister Crowley conjured up at Beliskin House, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I want Cthulhu in there. I don't want a ferret.
All right, John. Thank you so much. This has been awesome, brother.
Yeah.
This has been a great little discussion about ley lines and all kinds of different things.
I've enjoyed myself.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to tell everybody where they can find you, or what you're working on recently, and what you've been a part
of? I've got a list of me of links that I sent you guys. Just pop them on the bottom of the. Let's not bore people with reading out docs and comms and things. There's. I said that I'd big up Andy's book this afternoon. Where I told him I was going to cite him. No, that's a great book. It's called Strange Lands by Andrew L. Pachorik, and it's published by Dreamer Press, which is Dremour. It was published in 2019. You can buy that online. The Weird Harvest books, they need to be plugged because all the money goes to charity. We do everything volunteer. And they're good, aren't they? It's not just kind of like, I'm not just
very
saying
good.
that.
Very good.
There's some
And
really interesting stuff in there.
That interview with Walter Bosley you did is in what volume of Urban Weird is that in?
I think it's in the second volume.
The Spiritual Place? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it'll be in that one. I believe. And you can get those from it is actually it's through Lulu, but it's an actual press.
Yeah.
And that's just your https://folkhorrorrevival.com. That which is all one word /weird-harvest-press, and you'll find all of those.
That's WYRD.
Yeah, it's WYRD, not WEIRD. So yeah, me working on all manner of different things, any job that will come my way as far as illustration or writing is concerned. I've got a chainsaw that I'm doing up at the moment. Part of a chainsaw, which is the weirdest job. And I've also been commissioned to do some designs for a knife handle. There's something weird happening there. There's something to do with blades coming my way. I don't know what that is. But the chainsaw is weird. He's into Rob Zombie, and he wants some kind of Rob Zombie type writing up the side of his chainsaw, as you do.
Cool.
Because why not? You know,
and it's a present for his wife to hang on the wall. Yeah, that'll keep the fairies away. I've got a lot going on with a friend Chris Carr in Chicago, who's producing he's got a great app tracing H.P. Lovecraft sites around the globe, and he's used GPS technology to say this is where it is. It will tell you when you're close to it, and it will give you a passage from one of his stories, etc. And then what myself and other people do is we produce illustrations for the story so you can see it imagined, and it works. I can tell you this because I don't live far from Hadrian's Wall, and my phone was constantly telling me, "You are near Hadrian's Wall. This is a Lovecraft site." So yeah, it's really exciting, and we're starting to move into trying to do something with VR. We're exploring that. That's the next thing that him and I are discussing, which is going to be a really interesting thing. We're going to try and because we're really both into those old-fashioned stereoscopic images of the two photographs. So we're looking at basically how we can incorporate that. And I don't know how to yet, but it's really interesting because I'm starting to look at simulated universes and VR and reading William Gibson and stuff. And
cool.
So that's a whole new area for me. Yeah.
All right, John. Excellent. Well, hold on the line for us. We're going to close this section out. And guys, we'll be back to close out this show on Conspirinormal. Okay. Welcome back to Conspirinormal, guys. And we just had a really great interview with John Chadwick, who we also about to do a Patreon segment with. So you guys are going to have that for this coming Friday or Saturday. And Serfiel, some thoughts, man. Thank you also for putting this together with John.
Yeah, like I said before, I just really wanted to kind of provide a background to these ideas and go over the multiple dimensions of these ideas that, appear to be as old as humanity and all across the world, and, might have some modern connections as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was kind of a learning experience for me because this is a topic that I don't know a lot about, and I'm glad that we kind of tied in Walter Bosley, his work, and then also we tied in kind of like about like the fairy realm and folklore revolving around that. It was really good, and then also to hear John's like personal stories. And I think in the Patreon we're going to talk about dowsing and like thin places too, so you guys are going to get some more of this interview. So if you want to go to Patreon and see what we got going on there, Serfiel can tell you how to do that.
You can go to patreon.com/Conspirinormal, or if you don't want to sign up for a subscription, you can make a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. Help keep the lights on. We're going to be investing in some equipment stuff in the future, so that will definitely help.
Yeah, absolutely. And guys, also, you can go to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And also, did I mention Patreon's only $1? We're YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast. We're about 1,000 subscribers on there right now. So that's really good. And then also what really helps us too on iTunes is getting nice 5-star reviews, like the following one that I just got yesterday as we're recording this on Tuesday, the 12th of May. It says, "Good stuff. Conspirinormal is level-headed, open-minded, and ideologically diverse. There are hard to find characteristics for podcasts in this field. Keep up the good works, guys. Thanks for producing a stellar show."
That's awesome.
I'd like to thank Reed Marks for sending that.
Thanks a lot, man.
That really helps us out that way too. So it just rises us in the rankings. So, all right, guys, that's it. We will be back next time with some more weirdness, strange, paranormal, conspiracy-related stuff on Conspirinormal.
help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.